So, hi everybody. So again, my name is Toy Jones. Um, I am an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, an affiliate faculty in Women's Studies, Xavier University of Louisiana. Just a quick little snippet about me and my journey. So my PhD is in counseling psychology. I have a minor in multicultural studies that was kind of a catch-all for those of us who wanted to focus on like identity work. And so in my multicultural studies, the focus was Black population, BIWOC population, so Black, Indigenous, and women of color, and clinically as well as research. That's where I land with more attention to Black women. So in terms of research and clinical work, I've kind of been all over the place for a breadth of experience with Black women in mind. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is about, it's April, so it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And my heart beats for Black identified women who are often not discussed as often as they need to be in this conversation. So back to my journey though. So I've done work in community spaces where it was to work with either perpetrators or survivors. So I've had that in my background, being able to work in both of those sections. Um, Community mental health, counseling center. I've spent a lot of time in counseling centers, and the population there that I often found myself working with were women of color, survivors, and had a large collective of Black women that I was working with. So that was in Kansas, in Baltimore, in Chicago. So getting a kind of variety of experiences in that regard and working on a number of things that are related to and that don't necessarily come up in people's mind when we think about survivors of sexual violence. And I'll break down a bit more when I say survivors of sexual violence, because it means a number of things. And so things that I would have worked with this population, career work, so career journey, trying to find jobs. So what's going to be a good fit for me as I am coping with the trauma that I either recently experienced or what's ever coming up for me. So career coaching, career work is one of those spaces that I've worked in. General counseling, talking about sex, sexuality, recovery of whatever that may have been for that person, seeing it as something perhaps new. What we find in terms of the research and also in clinical work, when we think about the ways that the Black woman's body has been objectified, is that there's not enough attention also paid to Black women's sexuality in a way that really honors who they are and their lived experience. So that was part of the work as well. And then VA medical centers are just VA in general. So military sexual trauma is a thing, and it's often not reported. And then with the intersection of race and gender and really just trying to survive sometimes in those systems, which tend to be patriarchal and white supremacist, depending on who's in your space, it can be hard for survivors to come forward and report, knowing the additional traumas that they'll have to go through when trying to just get heard and address the needs that they have in that moment. So been in a number of spaces that has allowed me to do that work and other work as well. But today I really want to talk to you about it being April, how a lot of the messaging in April tends to be kind of generally focused. So we talk about women, we honor to some degree that there are men survivors. Race is one of those things that get missed. And so in that, what often gets missed is the intersection of being woman and Black, and how those survivors journey through recovery, building community, and all of those pieces. So there are a few statistics that I kind of want to share, and I'm mindful that I'm supposed to also give a lecture, I think, on Thursday, and so some of this might be a repeat. If it is, I do apologize. And so I do want to give a few statistics just to kind of frame our mind around the conversation in general. And if you want, I can share these sources and some of the literature that I pulled to kind of, structure this conversation. So the numbers in regards to how often someone in this country in these states is the victim. And so you'll notice in my language, I go back and forth between survivor and victim. I often will use survivor, but I think it's also important to recognize, especially when we're talking about Black bodies and Black women, that there has been some type of assault, some type of victimization taking place, right? So that not to not honor Black women as survivors and as resilient, but too often we approach and think of Black women and this very strong Black woman, they can take everything. It's not a big deal for them. We can just talk about it and move past it. But a lot of our sisters are hurting. So you'll see me go back and forth between that language to honor the experience, but also to orient our minds that these things do happen to Black women and that we need to attend to them. So the numbers have changed throughout time. I can remember, I think as early as 2015, 2014, maybe 2013, even though I guess that's not that long ago, but it just feels like a lifetime ago, that the number was every 90 seconds, someone in the state, generally speaking, becomes the survivor of an attempted or completed rape, just kind of under this umbrella of sexual violence. So as of today, and I imagine that number is going to continue to change, especially given the pandemic and COVID and people not being able to leave their homes and in many ways being trapped with someone who is a perpetrator, that number is now 73 seconds. So every 73 seconds, someone becomes a survivor of rape, whether it's attempted or completed. And so you can even kind of count in your mind, just as we even go on, how often this. Um, and another statistic, so I'm gonna go through a few here. 5 out of every 1,000 rapists end up in prison. And that number has actually improved from what it used to be, going back as far as 1993. And we know that for folk, mostly women identified persons ages 12 to 34, that they're the most highest at risk, making up about 54% of those who are at the most risk for sexual violence. 1 out of every 6 American women are survivors of either an attempted or a completed rape. Young women are especially at risk. The statistics around college and community really demonstrate the vulnerability of this population when it comes to survivors, when it comes to sexual violence. Men and boys are also at risk. The numbers look a bit different. So it's about 1 out of every 10. And even then we have to conceptualize it from a standpoint of recognizing how, it's difficult for men to come forward as well, right? So patriarchy and toxic masculinity impacts us all, and it does not allow for folk to take those necessary steps to say, I've also been hurt, someone also did this to me, because toxic masculinity doesn't necessarily allow for that. um, Gender diversity, so trans identified folk are at higher risk too. And so if you think about the social layers that play a role in just their everyday lived experience, and with something like sexual violence, whether it be rape, assault, harassment, and how these types of traumas don't necessarily show up on the body, then what that looks like for them to come forward and say, this happened to me, and have to provide evidence, and evidence, depending on the state and the space that you live in, can look a number of ways and may not even be a thing for that space. So we know that sexual violence has a lot of long-term impacts when it's left unchecked, when there hasn't been any interventions. Depression being one of those things, PTSD, flashbacks, people might experience substance abuse, self-harm, dissociation from the body. We see this often come up, especially in interpersonal and or romantic relationships. So if it's someone who is in a sexual relationship with their partner, and that sex in and of itself can be triggering, that person might dissociate from that space. And that can cause a number of issues for that person, as well as that interpersonal relationship. Eating disorders, a lot of the literature, especially around Black women, discusses how there is a sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And in that conversation is about this community of silence and how often Black women are expected to be strong and resilient and powerful and just move throughout the world with all of these assaults, in addition to sexual violence that could be happening on our bodies and the results of that. So a lot of studies look at how Black and brown women, but especially Black women who are incarcerated currently, are also survivors of some form of sexual violence. And in particular, a lot of them being childhood sexual violence. So those are a few of the statistics. Um, and for me in my work, where I'm at currently, so there's a number of projects that I do, but Black women and sexual violence, whether it be to treat, to intervene, and to help, you know, to promote better psychological, emotional, behavioral health, but also recovery of joy, is where my heart really lies. So this is the project that I'm focusing on right now. But so in that conversation, to go back to what I was saying, when we talk about sexual violence, Black women are often missed and not discussed. And so the research that I'm currently doing is really paying honor and homage to Black women and their lived experiences when they're survivors of sexual violence. So I do want to give a few statistics that are specific to Black women, and I just printed them off because I'm in the middle of writing something, so bear with me as I try to find what I just printed off. 1 second. So there's a number of social variables that play a role. So when we think about how Black women are portrayed in the media, right? And that the caricatures that we discuss throughout history, when we think about Jezebel, Mammy, all of these kind of historical caricatures also play a role in the landscape when we're talking about survivors of sexual violence. So if we see Black women as being predatory or being and so I'm lifting a term that is about identity, but not necessarily in that way. So when I talk about like asexual, I'm not talking about LGBTQIA, but talking about without sex appeal, without desire for sex. And so that colors the conversation, even if it's unconscious, when we think about how do we take care of Black women. So a few statistics here about Black women. 40 to 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact by the age of 18. And so for researchers like myself, we're thinking through, yes, and what does this coercion look like? Because if we think about it from a broader lens, it's more than just penetrative kind of assault, right? It can be more than just rape. It can be sexual assault. It can be people in the community telling Black women about their bodies. It can be the language that we use with little girls saying things like, you're fast, or how are you developing so quickly? So even just the kind of coercive language that we can use to really describe how our Black girls and women grow up. 4 in 10 Black women have been subjected to intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. And then 40% of confirmed sex trafficking survivors in the US are African American. So the landscape in this research is really, really large. And we have these statistics. And the research has really, in the past, taken on reporting numbers, thinking through the interventions that are kind of not necessarily structured for us. And still what's missing is Black women's stories. So in the research that I'm currently doing, I'm looking through the little amount of literature, but a lot of popular culture stuff that honors and gives space to Black women to be able to share what their journey has been like and discussing the themes that they've experienced throughout time. So whether it's been, I don't talk about my sexual assault, I don't talk about it because if I talk about it, it's gonna make me upset and then I can't focus and take care of my family, and then just kind of this ongoing cycle. Or it's talked about in a way that it's dismissed, or that I don't talk about it because I won't be believed, or it's gonna be re-traumatizing, or I might be seen as criminal, or that I was the predator and be questioned and blamed for everything. So some of the same themes we see in other spaces, but the intersection of race makes it different and makes it heavier in ways than perhaps some of our general population. So in my class right now, in human sexuality, we're talking about this very thing. And for many of them, when they're asked to just kind of give a projective answer, so when you think of a survivor of sexual violence, who comes to mind? And for many of them, it's a white woman. And it's often framed in this kind of more traditional view of feminist and radical feminist, which doesn't give honor to Black feminism or womanism, but that it's this white woman who either is lying about the rape and or who that's just where the attention goes. And so even in this population that's most vulnerable, because this human sexuality class is made up of 18 to 24-year-olds, majority Black, that's the first thing that pops into their mind. But in their second thought, they can also recognize that it's not representative of my family. And so that doesn't pop into my mind first, but I have a story that I know is not in media, that's not shared in literature, that I just kind of hold because, and they may not be able to speak to all the reasons as to why they hold it, but they do name things like nobody really believes Black women, or the intersection of all of the things such as police brutality. So if we think about the Say Her Name campaign, if we think about all of these pieces that play a role in Black women's lived experience, those stories then get overshadowed. And although not as helpful, community of silence really is to protect the community. Although it's not helpful, it could be damaging to us, but it's done out of protection. So we hold those stories, we don't share them because the goal is just survival. So that's the research that I'm doing right now and hoping to get back into the community. It very much connects to what I was doing in the clinical world before I became academic and was just doing this. Um, the themes that, well, I've already just kind of shared the themes that I'm currently discovering right now. But I am curious to see as we come more out of the pandemic, and especially with the social movements that continue to impact us, because young folk are, especially our Generation Zers, are just approaching activism and dismantling all of the isms that very much play a role in how we navigate our lives in a way that is unapologetic and very much loud and out in the open. So I am curious to see as we continue to come out of the pandemic and when we're allowed to come back together and to form these communities where it's safe spaces and affinity spaces, the themes that will emerge, the continued themes that will emerge, and the stories that will be shared. Yeah. So that's all that I have for right now. There will be an extended version for the lecture in the class on Thursday.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So we can spend some of this time asking you questions. And so I'm going to open it up and see if there's some burning questions from the Reach Out clinical staff.
Well, I have a question in regards to clients that you receive that have gone through these things, and like how do they respond on the idea of speaking out about it?
Yeah, so it's very individualized. And when I was in that role, working under supervision as a clinician in those spaces, they ultimately would get to decide for themselves, right? So in speaking with me, if they came to me for that, that was different. And then for some of the folks, some of the Black women that I was working with, part of what they felt like their recovery was to speak in a larger platform. So whether that be like a speaker series where they join a group and they share it with other survivors, or whether they go to things like, so I'm thinking about college age students, if they go to things like Take Back the Night, and then share their story there with a community of persons that are in support. But in most of those cases, there's like microphones and spaces where their story can be heard, even when folk are not there. Or whether it be education in the community. So some of them saw that as part of perhaps their recovery. And I use recovery very loosely because it's an ongoing thing, right? But part of their healing, part of their coming to a space where they feel more congruent. So that was part of it for some of them, but not for all. some of them, and I'm mindful that there are Black women among us who may never enter into therapy, but have found support in the spaces that they need it, and have formed community, and they are taken care of in similar ways, or if not better ways. So there's that. And as you asked that question, I was thinking about, was it maybe a year ago? I think it was a year ago. It was the summer as soon as we left for the pandemic. And on Xavier's campus, people were taking to Twitter, Black women were taking to Twitter and were disclosing what had happened to them while being on campus. We're disclosing names, but we're also saying things that no longer am I going to hold this anymore. And using the hashtag Me Too. I know the young women who were part of kind of the origin of doing that. And part of it was to reclaim, in many ways, the Me Too movement that was founded and started by a Black woman, and then in many ways turned into something else. So that was kind of what was in their mind, but also for them, they saw it as a way of no longer carrying the burden, or carrying most of the burden that they have been living with for quite some time. So for some, yes, and for others who may choose not to do that, they're still able to get, so it's not necessary. It's really individualized for what that person might need.
Understood.
Yeah, some of that, I can hear your womanism in the way in which you speak, understanding what we know from the research about how Black women are resilient in the face of challenges. And one of those is testifying. And so it's giving voice, not being silenced, being able to talk about it. And there's power in that whenever, we experience some form of trauma, is that we can't let anyone else take our power from us. And part of that is voice, of being able to speak out and talk about it. And so often we go into the shadows and we don't want to tell anyone. But, one of the things that we know is that we have to do that. But Black women in particular do a really good job with that. And in the research literature, it's called testifying. And of course, a lot of that comes out of the Black experience, the church experience, which is related to historical trauma around race-based trauma, and why it's so important for us to, on Sunday morning to testify, to say such and such has happened, but how we've made it through and how they've made it over. In the Latinas and the work that's been done, particularly with Chicana women, they have found the same thing, in that it's known as testimonios. And so it's the same thing, and it's the power of women of color to be able to tell our story in our own words, in our own way, to be able to do that. So certainly the work you're doing is very needed, to give voice to those experiences.
I'm curious about the actual research. You mentioned this hesitation of Black women to come forward and tell their stories. So I'm wondering if you'll give a little detail about your criterion, and even where you're finding these audiences where you can do the research.
Yeah. So I can talk a bit about, because my computer is going in and out, so I think I heard all of it. So I can talk a bit about like the methodology and when I'm finding these spaces. So part of my clinical journey was that I started I started off definitely at organizations that allowed me to work with survivors specifically, and so I've maintained those relationships. Here in New Orleans. There's a many of organizations that continue to do that great work. So one organization that pops into my mind that I have a contact with, I know that they more so focus on sex work. And so even that's a whole another conversation about sex work versus human trafficking, and then the intersection of race around that. But so I do have some contacts in this area, but also in cities that I've lived and did clinical work in, that will allow me to find those audiences and to connect to those survivors. So the way that I approach the work also is participatory action. So it's not just me by myself, it's survivors actually informing it every step of the way. And so the way that we intend to, I guess, if to use this word, get the data, I'm thinking about it from a qualitative lens and interlocutor and story. So I'm saying data, but it's not my preferred word, but to get the narrative and get the stories and connect with the community. Is that, so we're going to start with exploration. So these focus groups, really visiting the spaces where these Black women find support, hearing their stories. And so if to use kind of like technical language, exploratory mixed methodology. So really starting with the qualitative piece and then maybe working our way to the quantitative piece later, where we can form some type of intervention together. Um, Phenomenology will definitely be a big piece of that. While I think we have a lot of themes and we understand some of the pieces that are going on that plays a role in Black women's lived experiences as survivors, whether or not they choose to report. I imagine, especially coming out of the pandemic, there's some things, there's some of these phenomena that are just not in the literature or in our mind. So yeah, that's how we intend to approach it.
We only have a few minutes left as you talk about PAR, participatory action research. I don't know if we've talked about emancipatory research methods, but definitely we could have a conversation about that. I'll be offering trainings on that in the fall, and some will be available synchronously, but I'm also going to have it offered asynchronously for people in other spaces. And definitely we believe that emancipatory allows us to not only make space for people to have their voices heard throughout the research process, to also partner with us in engaging in the research as horizontal partners in that process, but also for some what I call trans-subjectivity, where we also become transformed in the process of engaging in the research, and understand that there is a social justice element to the research that's being done. So I look forward to seeing your work out there. It's good. Awesome. Okay. So let's think about Gertown. So as we think about the services that we're providing in Gertown, I don't think that's a question that has been asked. We utilize statistical data from various research centers and community agencies that conduct surveys on a regular basis. So we're constantly updating our knowledge about the Gertown community. And we also have engaged in some data collection ourselves. Our most recent needs assessment ended. Let's see, a year ago would be COVID, so 2 years ago. And we engaged in 2 years of collecting data, qualitative data, by walking through the community. One of the things that we have to do to extend our work is to take a closer look, a deeper dive into just health in general. Because I just found it to be absent. And a lot of times when we're engaging in research as well as counseling, it's not what people are saying. Sometimes it's the absence of something. I'm wondering, why is that not there? And so it was very interesting. In all the data, people did not talk about their health issues, which is unusual because anecdotally, when I'm interacting with people in the community, they have a lot of health issues and they're fairly obvious, and do shape a lot of their mobility, and things like that. So that's one thing. There were a couple other things that we need to follow up on and get more information. But in following that strand about health, no, we do not ask about sexual assault. And given the demographics of that community, it would be really important for us to understand that. So we would like to maybe talk with you outside of a recorded session to just talk a little bit about how we might want to gather that information, because I think we should be talking about it. And, you know, given what I know about trauma, and I know a lot about trauma, given what I know about trauma, it's under investigated. So one of the things we do know is that just in general, that clinicians tend not to ask about trauma in an intake of all things.
Yeah.
And yet, when they surveyed patients or clients, that something like 70% of the time they thought their presenting problem was related to some prior trauma. So there's a real disjuncture there between therapists and patients, clients, that we rarely ask it, and yet they think most of the time their presenting problems are related to it. So so I think this is definitely an area that we in Reach Out Clinical Services can really apply your knowledge to be able to help the community, help the Birdtown community residents. And it can generalize, so it's not even just stopping at sexual assault and sexual violence, of also race-based trauma.
Yeah.
And about, you know, how do we integrate that into the work that we do. You'll see when you come into our class on Thursday that the students watched a video of a counseling program for Native Americans that was around substance abuse. And every other word was about nation building. And we had a whole conversation about counseling and integrating nation building, and, you know, how that's absent from our language, you know, in our work. And why not? Why shouldn't we incorporate nation building into counseling the way Native Americans do? We could do that with African Americans as well, because it's good for our overall mental health. So yeah, you'll have a great conversation on Thursday, I'm sure.
Right.
As good as today, if not more. So wow, we really thank you for coming into our space and giving us a peek into your ongoing research.
Thank you for having me.